You were about to go.
Check, check. I don't know where you went, but check, check. Test one, check, check. Test one, check one. This is for the lady who asked for a mic check. Check one, testing 1, 2. However, this is not the microphone that'll be used. The podium mic is a different sound. And it's been pushed way down because the governor doesn't want it higher. And it will sound different. Check one, check 1, 2. Check 1, 2. Check 1, 2. Test 1, 2. Check 1, 2. Check 1, 2. Check 1, 2. This is mic level. Check 1, 2. Check 1, 2. Check 1, 2. Test 1, 2. Check 1, 2. Check 1, 2. And I'm going to stop right now. Check 1, 2. 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 Check. Everybody else has it. Check 1, 2. Check 1, 2. Check 1, 2. Check 1, 2. Check, check, check. Check 1, 2. Check 1, 2. Are you getting it? Check 1, 2. Is it your cable? Because he's getting it. Are you guys getting audio? You're getting audio? Check, check. Check 1, 2. Check 1, 2. Check, check. Check 1, 2. Check 1, 2. Check 1, 2. Check 1, 2. We haven't met. Matt, I'm Gary. I'm the other technician. You're working with Marty for the most part, but both of us do these things, so.
Oh, great.
Yeah, good to see you. And it used to be called out at the Capitol with a podium and a couple of speakers when he did those rotunda things, and I haven't been called out there for like 2 years now. Does he still do them?
Well, probably because of the Capitol construction and the whole.
Yeah.
Right.
Well, back up, would you? Check 1, 2. Check 2. You good? Okay, now it's going to sound different because this is here and I'm eating it, but that mic is pushed all the way down because they don't want to hide. Check 5. Check 5. No, she's got it.
Test check 1 2 1 2 1 2 1 2.
Okay, so if I go,
So it's going to work. That's good.
okay, so I'll have to have this. Podium will be down, correct?
Yeah, well, depending on what's going on, we may have a little. Yeah, we probably will have the podium down to start with. Yeah. Hold up here, and this is where your music's going to be. Test check 1 2 1 2 1 2.
So I'm gonna have to make sure this is ready to go.
Yeah, and when you're doing, while you're getting it ready, maybe have it potted down so there isn't. Bank of the University of Minnesota Minneapolis campus for this live broadcast of Governor Mark Dayton's State of the State address on the Minnesota News Network and a video live stream at theuptake.org. I'm Bill Werner, Minnesota News Network, joined by Mike McEntee with The Uptake.
So just fade out then?
Yeah, fade the music, I think, at that point, and then we probably ease up the podium. I have a feeling we're going to have a lot of stuff going on. There's going to be people saying, escorting in the honorable constitutional officers of the state of Minnesota and all that kind of thing. So we'll have to kind of keep that stuff down.
Yeah, so I'm not going to be able to, I'm probably not going to get be able to record the intro, but then once I'm done with the music, then I'll go and start the live recording of the live stream, you know what I mean?
Yeah, right.
But I'll have to unplug this, probably.
Well, yeah, that's once the governor.
Or can I record right into this from this?
No, you don't have any connection. Are you planning on recording it on the internet
Yeah.
feed? Okay, have you checked that?
Well, it's not live yet.
Yeah, okay.
But I'm saying, so I can't run the speech. I can't record off of there.
Well, not off of the board. I don't think we don't have the right connections, and we would need an interface box like one of those blue
Yeah. So when I'm
sound
done,
card boxes.
So when I'm
Yeah.
done with this, I'm gonna have to unhook this.
Yeah, because we only need it at the beginning. I mean, there's no reason to do music at the end. I don't think. It just complicates it.
Yeah, I don't.
And no, just do it at the beginning, and unplug it, and then do your recording. And you don't have to worry about if you miss the first part of the speech anyway. I've already looked at. See, look at. We're not going to have a sound. We're not going to have a sound bite until here, till page 3. So
Do you know where you kind of want them already?
oh, sure. Well, part of them. I haven't gone through the whole speech yet, but.
We're going to ask everyone just to take their seats and get ready for the program to begin. Thank you all very much. If everyone could just begin to take their seats. Thank you so much.
Would you please take your seats? Program will begin shortly.
We're just going to ask everyone to go ahead and take their seats. Thank you so much.
Good evening, everyone. Please make your way to a seat and settle in for a comfortable evening at the University of Minnesota. My name's Eric Kaler. It's my honor and privilege to serve as president of the University of Minnesota, our state's land-grant engine for innovation, job creation, and education in preparation of the next generation of Minnesota's leaders. It is truly an honor to host Governor Dayton's 2016 State of the State Address on our Twin Cities campus, and a pleasure to have under one roof all 201 of our legislators who represent districts that include thousands of our students and employees, our campuses in Crookston, Duluth, Morris, Rochester, and the Twin Cities, our extension offices and research centers, and more than 250,000 alumni, including many of you who live and work in all 87 of our counties. In June of 1858, just weeks after Minnesota became a state, Governor Henry Sibley offered the very first State of the State address. And lo and behold, he mentioned the value of public education and of a university for the new state, our new state. And Sibley said, quote, "There is no object of more importance to the permanent prosperity and character of our state than the diffusion of intelligence among the people, and especially the education of the rising generation." Ever since those words, you, our elected officials, and we, the students, faculty, staff, and alumni of this university, have been remarkably strong partners in driving Minnesota's prosperity for the common good of our citizens. I'm extremely grateful to you for our partnership, and may it grow ever stronger. On behalf of the entire statewide University of Minnesota community, thank you all again for visiting our campus, and thank you, Governor Dayton, for the honor of hosting this historic event. Thank you.
Please join me in prayer. Gracious God, loving God, source of life, source of love, thank you for this night, for this moment in history as we gather at this great university. Bless all of the men and women in this room who represent our state government. We pray for your wisdom upon all of them as they serve in all of the branches of government. Thank you for their devotion, their passion, their desire to bring forth good, to bring fairness, to bring justice, to bring stability, and to bring an even greater quality of life to all of the people of this state. Guide them, bless them in all of their efforts as they work together. We thank you for all of our past governors, one or two who may be here this evening. Grant unto them, we pray, strength and health. We thank you for all of those who have served or are serving in our military, and we pray your blessing upon them and guide them, protect them. We pray for our governor, Governor Mark Dayton, and we pray that your healing presence be upon him as he continues to recover from surgery. Bless him with good health throughout this year and in the coming years. Give unto him, we pray, your wisdom, your vision, your courage.
Welcome to McNamara Alumni Center on the East Bank of the University of Minnesota Minneapolis campus for this live broadcast of Governor Mark Dayton's State of the State address on the Minnesota News Network and a video live stream at theuptake.org. I'm Bill Werner, Minnesota News Network, joined by Mike McEntee with the Uptake. We will hear Governor Dayton's address shortly, and then Senator Paul Gazelka will deliver the Republican response to the State of State address. We're being a little bit quiet here, Mike, because the invocation, the prayer by the chaplain is underway, and we expect that the governor will be escorted in, the other constitutional officers first, prior to the governor's arrival here.
We're going to use our best golf voices here while this is going on.
I think so, yes, exactly. We'll see whether the chaplain hits the ball on the green or not. This is going to be an interesting State of the State address, Mike, because we have an extremely short legislative session. It's the latest start of a legislative session just yesterday in recent memory.
No, in ever. I think somebody was. I think Rachel Stassenberger was doing the checking on that from the Pioneer Press, and it is the latest ever that we've had this start. And it is only 10 weeks, and there's a lot to get done in 10 weeks.
There certainly is. And of course, what's really motivated this, or what's put us in this position, is that the fact that the Minnesota State Capitol is in a state of being torn up, of badly being torn up for major renovations.
That's actually become a point of contention between the two parties on the very first day in the House. They were accusing each other of knowing or not knowing that this was going to be the case, and who had access and who didn't to the House chamber.
And 258, as I understand, is the number of people that are allowed in the Minnesota State Capitol building at one time for various reasons of safety and the fire marshal regulations and so on, and they're parceling out passes to the press and other people.
If you're lucky, you get a golden ticket to go into the House chamber. If not, you're outside.
Exactly right. And on the opening day of legislative session, of course, yesterday there was also quite a dispute that erupted between Democrats and Republicans on the issue of unemployment benefits for unemployed Iron Range miners. Essentially what happened there is that Republicans wanted to pass the bill and Democrats said no, because business tax cuts are part of the package as well, and that's where it stands in the Minnesota House, and it's stalemated, I guess you would say, at this point.
It is, and it's going to be an interesting battle to see here what happens. What's going on behind us, by the way, is this is actually a joint session of the House and Senate that's convening here, and so we're hearing that starting in the background, waiting for the governor to come in. And as soon as he, of course, speaks, we'll be going right to the podium.
And the various officers, the members of the Supreme Court and the constitutional officers are being escorted in now. I believe we have the Supreme Court members now that are coming into the room here at the McNamara Alumni Center on the East Bank campus of the University of Minnesota.
Yeah, normally this is in the House chamber, which is large enough for all of this, but of course, as we just talked about, the number of people that can be in the Capitol, you couldn't get everybody who has to be here in the Capitol.
Exactly.
It's applause now for the Supreme Court justices coming in.
Let's speculate. We got a minute or so before the governor begins his speech. I think it's probably a fair assessment that he's going to say something about this situation with Iron Range unemployment benefits.
I think that's a guarantee that you're going to hear about that. I think you're also going to hear about some of the other themes that he's been promoting up until this point. He's going to definitely talk about what he wants in education. It's something he was denied this last legislative session. He is going to probably go for something on that again.
We're talking about pre-kindergarten, or basically state paid pre-kindergarten.
Pre-kindergarten, right. And there's been pushing back and forth on political lines on that. The Republicans saying that's. I think there was in the session we saw before the legislature, I think Dayton and Doubt got into an argument over this, and Dayton was saying, well, the reason that you're against this is because it would help the unions, and you think that they would vote Democratic because of that. And that's the kind of the rhetoric that we've got going on this.
And even the broader context, of course, is the state budget. And as a matter of fact, even Democrats in the Minnesota Senate, Senator Tom Bach specifically, cautioned that the state budget can't handle universal pre-kindergarten for what would be a long period of time, a long-term budget commitment beyond just this current 2-year period when we have a budget surplus.
Yeah, we're certainly going to hear, Governor Dayton, I think, is very proud that the state does not have a deficit anymore, that it has a surplus, and I think he's going to probably talk about that tonight, and that he is going to be very protective of not wanting to go into deficit spending again. And so anything that's going to be out there in terms of spending is going to have to be paid for either by the surplus or revenue coming from someplace else.
I suspect that the governor will also be talking about transportation.
I think that's a good bet.
He has advanced proposals for a number of years to increase transportation spending, and he wants to pay for it with a gas tax increase. The legislature, Republicans in particular, have not gone along with that, and they say that they are going to continue to oppose that. The governor actually, during his during I believe it was the budget forecast in November, indicated that the gas tax is dead. But his actions after that have really belied that position in the sense that he still is saying, well, show me an alternative.
Yeah, I think that's what he's looking for, is an alternative for somebody to come up and suggest it. And by an alternative, he means something that's going to fund it long term, not something that's coming from the state budget money that goes up and down every year and is controlled by the legislature, but something that is dedicated to fixing the roads all the time.
And the Republicans, on the other hand, will say that they have advanced a proposal that taps current money that's available in the state budget surplus plus some additional funds, and they say they could get to the same point without tax increases.
But then
that's the heart of the debate.
And then Governor Dayton comes back and says that blows a hole in the state budget because you're taking away money that was already in the general fund. So that's where it ends up.
Exactly. And whether we have anything happen on that issue this legislative session, I think that most analysts think that it's doubtful, despite all of the rhetoric and the bows and the curtsies to providing transportation funding. That is, increases in transportation funding. How do you do it politically? You certainly, I don't think, could do it with a gas tax increase in an election year. That would be a real problem for members on both sides of the aisle.
It really would. See, this election, we don't have everybody up, but we do have enough people up that it would be a problem.
Legislative escorts will escort the governor to the podium.
And now here comes Governor Dayton.
Of course, all in the room on their feet, giving the governor a standing ovation. We'll see what happens as his comments proceed tonight.
And he seems to be walking just fine. Seems to be recovering from his surgery quite well.
Listening to live coverage of Governor Mark Dayton's State of the State address from McNamara Alumni Center on the University of Minnesota campus in Minneapolis. Governor Mark Dayton approaching the podium. I can't quite see from our vantage, but I assume that he's shaking hands with some of the lawmakers as he proceeds. to the front of the room here.
I think he's up there waving, and he will be starting here in just a minute or so as soon as the applause dies down. The governor is not going to talk over the applause, I think.
Members, I present to you the Governor of the State of Minnesota, the Honorable Mark Dayton.
There's always a lot of pomp and circumstance in these events.
Less so than usual, I think, when it's over at the Minnesota House Chamber, but there certainly is sufficient pomp and circumstance now as well. Here's the governor with the 6th State of the State address.
Lieutenant Governor Smith, Mr. Speaker, members of the Minnesota House of Representatives, Madam President, Majority Leader, and members of the Minnesota Senate, Madam Chief Justice, and the distinguished members of the Minnesota Supreme Court and Court of Appeals, my fellow constitutional officers, members of my cabinet and staff, other distinguished guests, my family and friends, my fellow Minnesotans. Thank you, President Kaler and the Board of Regents, for graciously hosting us here at the University of Minnesota tonight. As most Minnesotans know, our state capitol is undergoing a monumental renovation and is largely inaccessible. So I want to begin tonight by paying tribute to the legislators and other state officials who have for the past 2 years sacrificed their workplace for the good of Minnesotans during the next century. Befitting the respect and even reverence that our citizens feel to this magnificent Minnesota landmark, legislators of both parties have worked exceptionally well together to make this enormous undertaking a reality. Supreme Court justices, constitutional officers, state officials, and many citizens have also devoted countless hours to help lead and guide it. I hope that our fellow citizens will recognize and appreciate that in this important instance, your elected representatives have done their jobs very well. I look forward to making this address next year at our newly renovated state capitol. I know the legislators will be even more delighted to have returned to it. When I took office 5 years ago, I pledged a better Minnesota. There's no doubt in my mind that our state is better today than it was back then. But don't take my word for it. Instead, look at our accolades from many national organizations. Gallup ranks Minnesota first in the nation in its 2015 Job Creation Index. It's the first time Minnesota has achieved this national distinction. CNBC recently ranked us the best state in the nation for business. AARP says Minnesota is the best state to retire in, and noted that we offer some of the nation's best housing, health care, and other services to our senior citizens. Wallet Hub recently said Minnesota is the best state in the nation for women's economic and social well-being. Politico ranked us the second strongest state in the nation in its 2015 The States of Our Union report. Fortune Redfin said we're the third best state in which to own a home. And we were named one of the 5 best-run states in the nation last year by 24/7 Wall Street. It's hard to get Minnesotans to admit that our state is doing better. Most are too Minnesota modest to say it. Others don't want to believe it. And of course, for too many others, it's still not true. We should take deserved pride in what we have accomplished in Minnesota for our families, for other families, and for our communities, because we have worked hard to earn it. Minnesota works because we work hard to make it work. Let me say that again. Minnesota works because we work hard to make it work. We have a magnificent state with incredible beauty and priceless natural resources. But we don't have some other states' easy advantages. We have no tourist-tempting oceans or mountains, no oil or natural gas to pad our state revenues. We aren't located in our largest commercial centers on the east and west coasts, although as my son Eric Dayton, who is here tonight, has pointed out, we're something better. We're north. Minnesotans have always built our success through our hard work. Whether farmers in their fields, workers in their factories, executives behind their desks, teachers in their classrooms, truckers in their cabs, or doctors in their clinics. Whether through our brains or our brawn, we've worked hard to earn our individual success and our collective progress. The corollary is that if we stop working together, we stop making progress. When we slacken our efforts, pause, or take a break, we fall behind. We should have learned that lesson with our transportation systems. We curtailed our investments, failed to keep pace with our growing population and economy, and we are now suffering the consequences of inadequate and unsafe highways, roads, and bridges, and inadequate transit. We stopped making the investments of other states in early childhood care and education, providing all-day kindergarten over a decade behind other states, still debating voluntary pre-kindergarten, and then wondering why we haven't eliminated the achievement gap. It's pretty straightforward. We succeed when we do what we have to do to be successful. We fail when we stop. That is why we can't stop now. There's still so much that we must do, so many challenges and opportunities that if we face them and seize this moment, will propel our state farther ahead. To begin, too many Minnesotans are still suffering. It is imperative that we devote some of our time and the resources available over the next 10 weeks to relieving some of that suffering and rectifying some of those inequalities. For starters, I will hold the House Republicans to their commitments the last couple of months to provide 26 weeks of extended unemployment benefits retroactively to those good men and women on the Iron Range. Men and women who, through no fault or choice of their own, have been victimized by illegal dumping of foreign steel into this country. If you keep those promises and send the Iron Range families the unemployment benefits they need and have earned, I will sign that legislation next week. If you don't, it will be a broken promise that people will long remember. I pledged to work with you in this session to provide meaningful unemployment tax reductions for Minnesota businesses. But that change deserves proper review through your established committees and procedures. To hold $29 million of desperately needed unemployment benefits hostage to $272 million in fund cuts is unnecessary, and it's cruel. We must also take immediate action to begin to relieve the terrible and persistent racial inequalities embedded in our society. The median income for U.S.-born African-American families in Minnesota is 55% less than for white families, and their poverty rate is 4.5 times greater. The median income for Mexican-American families is 40% less than white families in Minnesota. Ojibwe family incomes are 56% lower. Somali family incomes are 71% lower than the average white family incomes in our state. That is unacceptable. And tragically, incidents of racial intolerance continue in Minnesota. In November, Esma Jama was attacked at a Coon Rapids Applebee's because she was not speaking English, although she speaks 3 languages. Another woman smashed a glass beer mug across her face. Esma sustained cuts across her face that required 17 stitches. She said, and I quote, "I can't believe after all these years somebody hit me because I'm different. Somebody hit me because I was speaking a different language." She said she's feeling traumatized and doesn't feel safe leaving her house alone. Quote, "I'm actually thinking about moving out of Minnesota. I'm scared for my life. I don't feel comfortable here anymore." I've invited Esma as my guest here tonight. I ask all of you to join me in showing her and all Muslim Minnesotans the open arms and the respect that they deserve. Asma? We're very glad you're a Minnesotan. 2 Sundays ago, the Lieutenant Governor and I paid one of the most profoundly painful site visits of my career. We went to a mosque in Minneapolis, which had been vandalized just days before. The broken outside doors had been repaired. However, there were still holes in doors and walls inside the mosque. This despicable act of bigotry was even worse than others. It desecrated a place of worship. A house of any religion should be sacrosanct. One of the most fundamental rights in our United States Constitution is the freedom to practice the faith of one's own choosing, free from interference by government or anyone else. In addition to being un-American, illegal, and immoral, this heinous deed had an even more searing effect. We saw children of ages 5 to 15 who had to walk by this damage on the way to their religious instruction classes. I said to the Lieutenant Governor, what does this say to them about who they are? About their right to be who they are? About their acceptance by other Minnesotans as they are? I urge all of us, as leaders of this state, to stand up and speak out together in denouncing any acts of racial or religious intolerance. Minnesota must be much better than this. We must also show our leadership by acting now to reduce the economic and other disparities in our state based upon race, religion, nationality, or disability status. We cannot resolve these disparities in one legislative session, but we must begin now. Next week, my supplemental budget will propose a significant initiative to provide better economic opportunities to Minnesotans of color all across our state. I will be advancing some of my ideas, but it is not intended to be a complete package. I look forward to the ideas and initiatives that you legislators will bring forward. I also invite community groups and civic organizations throughout Minnesota to bring forward their proposals. The final legislation should be as broadly inclusive as possible. Now, obviously, state government cannot make these necessary changes alone. Last night, I urged the members of the Minnesota Chamber to review their company's hiring practices and consider how they could do more to provide quality jobs that will reduce these disparities. It's time we stopped holding our schools and educators solely responsible for closing our state's opportunity and achievement gaps. Every facet of our society has a part to play. All of us share that responsibility. I want Minnesota state government to lead by example. We have made increasing the diversity in state agencies and services a top priority. When I took office, 8% of state employees were women and men of color. Now that number is 10%. So under the outstanding leadership of our terrific Chief of Staff, Jamie Tincher, we're doubling down on state hiring practices. Our goal is to double the percentage of minorities working in state government when I leave office in 2019, so that our diversity accurately reflects the diversity in Minnesota's workforce. We will have to manage these and other priorities within a new budget forecast, which is not as robust as before. We have today a remaining $900 million budget surplus for this current biennium, which ends June 30th, 2017. It does not count an additional $600 million of the surplus which was deposited in our budget reserve after last November's forecast. boosting that reserve to an unprecedented $1.6 billion. 19 other states are still facing budget deficits. By contrast, we have righted our state government's fiscal ship. We have turned the $6 billion projected deficit we faced when I took office in January 2011 into projected surpluses. We have paid back our schools over $2 billion borrowed from them. We've cleaned up the other games and gimmicks used to disguise that fiscal mess. And as I just said, we have built the budgeted reserve fund to an unprecedented level. Yet this forecast should give serious pause to everyone's wish list for this legislative session. The projected surplus for the current biennium, from now through June 30th, 2017, dropped by 25%, from $1.2 billion to $900 million, since the previous forecast just 3 months earlier. The projected surplus for the next 2 years, fiscal years 2018 and 19, dropped by 42%, from $2 billion to $1.2 billion. State spending is projected to decrease from the previous estimates in both biennia due to unexpected reductions in healthcare spending. The competitive bidding we required last year for Department of Human Service contracts is one of the principal contributors to these healthcare savings. However, tax and other revenues are projected to be $427 million less in this biennium and $698 million less in the next biennium than previously forecasted. I'm especially concerned about the forecast for the next biennium. It assumes that those lower revenues and surpluses would occur despite continued growth in our state and national GDP in both 2018 and 2019. However, at the annual meeting of the National Governors Association 2 weeks ago, we heard from a panel of 5 prominent economists, all of whom predicted the strong likelihood of a national recession by 2018. Now, you've heard before the joke that the nation's economists have predicted 12 of the last 5 recessions. And we know that no one has a crystal ball that gives insight into economic conditions 2 years away. If, however, Minnesota's economy were to be caught in a national recession, the surplus projected for fiscal years 18 and 19 would quickly erode. Thus, my number one priority in this legislative session will be to protect the fiscal integrity of our state government. I will never forget the experience of coming into office in January 2011 and being confronted with a projected $6 billion deficit for the upcoming biennium. I will not leave that kind of fiscal disaster to my successor or to the people of Minnesota. This does not mean that I will propose to do nothing with a fiscal impact in this legislative session. My supplemental budget next week will propose some more modest spending increases and middle-income tax cuts. But we must make our decisions over the next 10 weeks with a close eye on the next 10 years. I support tax reductions for middle-income Minnesotans. My supplemental budget will again propose increasing the child care tax credit. The average cost of child care for Minnesota families is one of the highest in the nation. I will also support federal tax conformities, which will further reduce state income taxes for many Minnesotans. However, some people are proposing permanent tax cuts, which would put our state's budget once again on a fiscal precipice. They say, give it all back to the taxpayers. But that slogan is based upon a wrong premise and a wrong conclusion. Those surpluses did not come from raising personal income taxes on all Minnesotans. Many politicians say it, even though they should know it's not true. As a result, many people believe it. In 2013, we raised state income taxes on only the wealthiest 2% of Minnesotans. On only the wealthiest 2% of Minnesotans. No other Minnesotans received a state income tax increase unless, of course, their personal incomes increased. The personal income tax rates on those 98% of Minnesotans have not been changed for the past 15 years. Not once, and not since I became governor. In fact, we cut state taxes for over 2 million Minnesotans by $500 million in 2014. Our budget surpluses have resulted entirely from the income tax increases on the wealthiest 2% of Minnesotans and from more Minnesotans working, earning higher incomes, and thus paying higher taxes based on those higher incomes, not from higher tax rates. The other dead horse, which is being resuscitated for the current political economic debate, is that those tax increases are the cause of Minnesota's slower projected economic growth in the next biennium. Our state recovered more rapidly than most other states from the Great Recession. Our increases in employment, state GDP, and per capita income outpaced the nation. However, those increases have leveled off, and the forecast predicts they will continue more modest growth over the next few years. So, of course, we are hearing the perpetual refrain that the state's high taxes and excessive regulation are driving businesses and jobs away and threatening our continued economic progress. I've worked in and around Minnesota state government for the past 39 years. I have always heard some say the taxes are too high and the business climate is too awful. If we have a budget surplus, it's because taxes are too high. If we have a budget deficit, it's because taxes are too high. I expect it will never change. If a meteor from somewhere in the universe should ever come crashing to Earth and land on Minnesota, it will be, some say, because our taxes here are too high. At this pivotal moment, however, it is critically important that we make the correct diagnosis of our economic situation so that we can prescribe the proper remedy. If a doctor misdiagnoses a patient's condition, the patient will get sicker and might even die. So it is with state policymakers. Our state economist said recently that the main drivers of slowing future growth in Minnesota's total employment and personal incomes are baby boomer retirements and less labor force growth, not state tax policies. She said, quote, "It's simply a factor of demographic change. When the boomers were in their prime working years, our workforce grew and our economy benefited. But we are going to produce a lot fewer workers in the next 2 decades as the boomers continue to transition out of the workforce. And that means we will need to use the talent of all the workers we have." She went on to say that the consequences of baby boomer retirements will be the Minnesota economic story for years to come. Furthermore, as recently as 1999 and 2000, Minnesota's then governor and legislature tried the experiment of cutting the state's personal income tax rates and providing tax refunds. They did so twice. And what was the result over the following decade? Did Minnesota's economy surge ahead of other states? No. Was there a demonstrable increase in private investment? No. Did Minnesotan standards of living improve? No. Even before the Great Recession, Minnesota's growth was not on par with many other states. Meanwhile, the state stopped improving critical functions. State support for higher education dropped drastically, forcing higher tuitions on students and their parents. Real estate funding for K-12 education was also cut, causing teacher layoffs, larger class sizes, reduced academic and extracurricular offerings. School and university upkeep and improvements lagged. The state avoided facing and funding its growing responsibilities for child care assistance, for mental health services, and for elderly care. Growing problems at St. Peter and Anoka state hospitals continued to fester and plague us still. Then, when the Great Recession arrived, with revenue depleted and fiscal reserves non-existent, the state's economic woes compounded and its services were further decimated. So what astounds me is why on earth would we want to go back and try that again?
You're listening to live coverage of Governor Mark Dayton's State of the State address from McNamara Alumni Center on the University of Minnesota campus.
In the past 5 years, by having state government do less or fund less than others are doing. We've done more for Minnesota, and we've done it better. All-day kindergarten, flood control and disaster relief, response to the avian flu epidemic and to Ebola, an increased minimum wage, the equal right to marry, early childhood education, two-year tuition freezes at the U and MNSCU, statewide property tax relief, and more. What we've been doing is working. Minnesotans are working. How can we stop now when there's more work left to do? Let me highlight just a few of those key areas. Take transportation. The facts are very clear. We must make additional investments to repair and improve Minnesota's transportation systems every year for the next 10 years, or they will get worse. Highways, roads, and bridges will become more crowded and less safe. Public transit will become more inadequate to serve our growing metro populations, and more commuters will be forced onto even more crowded streets and highways. Two questions remain. Will the legislature commit enough real money for the next 10 years to improve our state's transportation? And how will they pay for it? I made my proposal over a year ago. Many people didn't like mine, but it provided real money, and enough of it to make real transportation improvements all over Minnesota. The improvements people and businesses must have if they are to continue to thrive here. I'm waiting for an alternative. I'm willing to be flexible, but I will also insist on a real solution. No smoke and mirrors, no double counting existing revenues, no counting non-existent revenues. This is about construction projects, not campaign posters, and it's too urgent to be left for another year. We face another growing problem with the quality of our water in some parts of our state. Left unattended, this problem will become a crisis for some of our citizens and communities. We face the immediate challenge to provide help, especially to smaller communities in greater Minnesota, who must treat their incoming drinking water to make it safe for human consumption. The cost of those treatment facilities is prohibitive for some of them. My bonding bill proposes over $220 million of low-interest loans, grants, and technical assistance. It will not be enough, but it will be a start. Then we must face the multiple causes of our increased water contamination. This is a complex problem without a single or simple solution, but it is one we cannot avoid. Minnesota has a proud history of tackling environmental problems and finding effective solutions. When I was a boy in the 1950s, our neighboring town of Long Lake was dumping its untreated sewage into its namesake, Long Lake. It produced giant 70-pound carp for unsuspecting customers in Japan. But it made the lake unfishable and unswimmable for humans. A modern wastewater treatment plant starved the carp but saved the humans. That was progress. On an even larger scale, I recall in the 1970s when Reserve Mining Company was dumping its untreated taconite tailings filled with asbestos and other contaminants into Lake Superior. There was a huge uproar when the Minnesota Pollution Control Agency and finally a federal judge ordered them to stop. The company threatened to close, eliminating thousands of jobs if it had to change its ways. But they did change, and the plant is operated to this day until the recent industry shutdown. We will hear the same refrain from some who wish to avoid their share of responsibility for contaminating our state's waters. Fortunately, increasing numbers of their neighbors have accepted the challenge and are leading the way forward. In partnership with the U.S. Department of Agriculture, our state ag department has developed the Minnesota Agricultural Water Quality Certification Program. It provides voluntary opportunities for agricultural landowners to implement conservation practices that protect our water. In return, they gain regulatory certainty for 10 years. To date, our agriculture department has certified 104 farms totaling 60,000 acres. An additional 340 applicants are currently working towards certification, and another 450 applicants are expected by June 1st through partnerships with local soil and water conservation districts. The program has already reduced sediment loss on those properties by over 4,600,000 pounds per year, prevented over a ton of phosphorus from entering our water, and reduced nitrogen losses by an estimated 49%. That is important progress, but we must make more. All Minnesotans should have the right to clean, safe water for their drinking, bathing, and recreation. No one else should be allowed to take it away from them. Assuring that safety is our legal and moral obligation. There are other features in my bonding bill that deserve special mention. In fact, all of them do. We joust every year about the proper size of our bonding bill. Even though Minnesota ranks in the middle of a tier of states in bonded indebtedness, some believe that minimal capital construction is in the public interest. I strongly disagree. If we unnecessarily limit the state's capital investments, we unwisely limit its future. For example, many buildings on the University of Minnesota and MNSU campuses are badly in need of basic repairs. They cannot be expected to attract and retain first-rate students with second or third-rate facilities. They also need to build new facilities in which to provide world-class educations to their students, what their students will need to be successful in this global economy. And working with local employers, they need to redesign and retool their existing programs to better prepare their students for jobs that are now unfilled due to lack of the necessary training. I could make similar cases for every one of the capital projects I have proposed, and for many that I couldn't fit into my capital budget. I invite legislators to do even more. I urge you not to do less. Another crucial capital investment, which I will include in my supplemental budget, is expanding access to broadband for every part of Minnesota. This statewide access is vitally important, especially to our citizens and businesses who reside in greater Minnesota. Rebecca Willard, a genetics counselor in Belle Plaine, is also my guest here tonight. Rebecca? There you go. All right. Welcome. She wrote me a letter saying that she is able to do her work thanks to broadband internet access. She said, quote, "I currently live on a hobby farm outside of Belle Plaine. I am a laboratory genetic counselor and work for GeneDx, one of the nation's largest genetic testing companies. I was one of the first of what is now over 30 remote genetic counselors working for this wonderful company. Every morning I sit down in my home office and log into my company headquarters in Maryland. The ability to telecommute, has greatly expanded the opportunities available to me as a genetic counselor in Minnesota. Additionally, it has made it possible for me to be fully engaged with my family by eliminating a 2 to 3 hour drive to commute. My only problem is my current internet connection speed. This is painfully slow for the work I do. This is an extremely important issue for myself and my family, as quite literally my livelihood depends on it. I know that you have supported efforts to expand rural broadband, and I beg you to continue these efforts and encourage you to consider the truly rural farms throughout Minnesota. We need service too. Please keep up this important work. Becca, I hope you'll be right. Thank you. Elsewhere in Minnesota, the city of Bemidji has seen new business openings in diversified fields, due in large part to the city's high-speed internet access. 4 Bemidji businesses were recently ranked among the fastest growing in the United States by Inc. magazine. There are other important challenges and opportunities before us to continue to build a better Minnesota. In addition to clean water, clean air, and reducing global warming are other important priorities for my administration. Last month in Washington, the United States Supreme Court stayed federal enforcement of President Obama's Clean Power Plan. Here in Minnesota, some have questioned our decision to continue developing a plan to tackle the worst impacts of climate change. However, developing clean energy has never been about satisfying federal bureaucrats. Beginning with my predecessor, Governor Plenty, former Lieutenant Governor Pretner Solon, and other key legislators in 2007, it has always been about serving the best interests of our citizens. Over the past 5 years, Minnesotans have made their interests clear to my administration. From kids concerned that pond hockey doesn't start until January, to farmers trying to predict growing seasons, to folks wondering why this year's March blizzards have turned into 60-degree days. Many thousands of Minnesotans have expressed their concerns about the growing impacts of climate change. I received one letter from Paul and Susan Shirkey, who operate Wintergreen Dog Sled Lodge in Ely. They wrote, quote, "In the 35 years we've operated Wintergreen Dog Sled Lodge, we've watched our season diminish by nearly 20%, from an average of 116 operating days to 94. And our winter tourism industry is lucky at one. Dog sledding is very accommodating of marginal snow conditions. All our dogs need is a few inches of snow and off we go. But cross-country skiing and snowmobile tourism need a much more substantial snow base. Those tourism sectors are measuring their operating loss over the past few decades, not in days, but rather in weeks. In fact, during some recent winters, we've only had a 3 to 4 week window of optimal cross-country skiing and snowmobiling conditions. Here in Minnesota's Arrowhead region, one that has been renowned nationally as a winter recreation mecca. It's clear that we need to do more to protect Minnesota's climate and the lungs of our children and grandchildren by developing thousands of innovative clean energy jobs. We have an opportunity this session to build on the progress of our predecessors. Lieutenant Governor Smith and I are eager to work with legislators and with businesses to grow Minnesota's clean energy economy. Some of Minnesota's utilities, like Xcel Energy, are national leaders in developing wind, solar, and other clean energy alternatives. Let us proceed not by politicking with the health of future generations, but rather by protecting them. During my first 5 years, I have made additional education funding and new initiatives my top priorities. We have made vitally important progress. Much of it, however, was simply making up for past deficiencies. In fiscal 2012, real state support for higher education had fallen to its lowest level in 30 years. And even after the increases in state funding for K-12 education, Minnesota's per pupil expenditures place us in the middle of the 50 states. Our citizens properly place a very high value on the quality of their children's and grandchildren's educations. Overall, they have been very well served by our state's extraordinarily dedicated teachers, professors, and other educators. However, as we know, the challenges facing our schools are more diverse and difficult now than ever before. When I taught in New York City right out of college a few years ago, our multiracial students spoke 4 different languages. Today, well over 100 languages and dialects are spoken throughout our state, over 50 in some single school buildings. More and more students are coming to our schools less ready to learn from other states or other countries which lack our education standards. Some recent arrivals from other nations have had no formal education at all. And unfortunately, more children from more Minnesota families start school without the education and socialization experiences that most other children enjoy. They enter kindergarten or early elementary grades already behind, and they struggle to catch up. We have finally learned what many child development experts have been telling us for decades. The very first years of a child's life are deeply formative and determinative. If we don't prevent achievement gaps before they appear or close them quickly thereafter, it will require much more difficult and more expensive remedial efforts for years following. Increased legislative support for early childhood care and education has grown significantly over the past 5 years, and I thank you for that. Yet the numbers of children who desperately need those services continue to rise. Next week, I will propose further initiatives to help provide more children with the decent life beginnings that every child deserves. There are disagreements over how and where to best provide those services, particularly for 4-year-olds. Some of those disagreements are professional, others are political. 60,000 Minnesota 4-year-olds need Minnesota's grown-ups to go beyond their big self-interest and place those little interests first. In closing, as Minnesotans, we find ourselves at a crossroads. We, the elected leaders of our state, face important choices. Over the last 5 years, we have made great progress toward a better Minnesota. We can continue down that road and build a state that works better for all Minnesotans. Or we can reverse course and retreat to where we were just a few years ago, doing less and getting less. Minnesota has always been its best when we work together. We are better when we recognize and anticipate the challenges ahead and come together as one Minnesota to create opportunities for every child, every family, every person to succeed. That is the Minnesota which has built our success. That is the Minnesota that you and I must work together to achieve. Thank you very much.
Governor Mark Dayton, his 6th State of the State address, this time delivered not from the state capitol, but from McNamara Alumni Center on the East Bank campus of the University of Minnesota in Minneapolis. Of course, the state capitol in somewhat disarray, major reconstruction of that building. Mike McEntee with the uptake is with us. Mike, the governor hit on a lot of themes that were expected. Is there anything in the speech that struck you as maybe unexpected?
For me, the only unexpected thing was the guest that he pulled out of the crowd. And that was the woman who had been hit by somebody else, she, I believe Somali, and for speaking a different language than English. And there was a large round of applause for that. But there's also some nuances on some tax issues, I think, that were surprising.
And specifically, elaborate on that.
Well, you know, we're talking about the whole... well, it's not the tax issues as much as education is what I meant there. It's how we're paying for it and the gap that the Republicans talk about.
And the governor actually in the last bit of his remarks here talked about his pre-kindergarten initiative.
Yes.
He's gotten some of that, but he says, I will propose further increases. Right at the beginning of the speech, he talked about that same topic, so he kind of bracketed it with the pre-kindergarten issue. And he said, the state stopped making investments, and we wonder why we haven't eliminated the achievement gap. And that is the heart of the disagreement between Republicans and Democrats. And that, as a matter of fact, the governor and House Speaker Kurt Daudt got in quite a heated argument a little bit over a week ago at a pre-session briefing at the Capitol on that very topic, with the speaker saying that pre-kindergarten doesn't help close the achievement gap. The governor says, yes, it does. No, it doesn't. Yes, it does. And they went around about 5 or 6 times on that issue.
That was a fascinating discussion, because that's often, I wonder what happens behind closed doors that we don't get to see as the press, because when they get to these end-of-session deals, which is where a lot of this stuff comes up, that is the discussion that goes on, and it was really refreshing to see it out in the open.
The governor also, in his speech said the number one priority of his at this point is to protect state government's fiscal integrity. And he said the forecast should give serious pause to everyone's wish list of spending items, presumably, right. Excuse me. And I think that his comments about pre-kindergarten funding reflect that, in the sense that even the majority leader of the Senate, Tom Bach, indicated that the state's fiscal, even with the large surplus that the state can't afford.
Well, Senator Bach believes, and I think more people are coming around to this, that when you adjust for inflation, we maybe really don't have that much of a surplus, especially considering that there's been a downturn in the outlook here, and it may be that we are essentially working with a flat budget.
Let's look at one other major issue, and there's a lot of them we could talk about here, but we don't have all night, clearly, but that the governor brought up, and that was transportation.
Yes.
He says, I'm waiting for an alternative. In other words, he acknowledges, and I don't think it's any surprise, that his gas tax increase didn't get any traction at the legislature. He says, excuse me, he's willing to be flexible, but will insist on a real solution, and he says it's too urgent to be left for another year.
Yeah, but then he got into talking, and I think talking down to some of the suggestions that Republicans have made, which, talking about not double counting some income or, ghost income. So he's obviously, looking at different ways. He's saying that the ways that are being discussed right now aren't acceptable to him, and he's listening for something else. And I think he's waiting for people to come back to say, well, let's try that gas tax again.
I don't think that's going to happen.
It's a wrong year. It's a wrong year for that.
Right, either on the part of Republicans or Democrats. Okay, so we've taken a look at the rhetoric on one side of the aisle. We're going to hear the Republican response from Senator Paul Gazelka from Nisswa in just a couple of minutes. But first of all, I want to bring up Scott Peterson. I think he's waiting in the wings here, and Scott has been monitoring the social media. Twitter and thus and such. Scott, just generally, what are people saying?
What's interesting to me is that, generally speaking, the folks that were in the room, the way they reacted here in the room is pretty relevant to how people were reacting online as well. When he talked about racial tolerance, that got a great reaction in the room, but also got a great reaction on Twitter. What you would expect for the most part, the things that he had to say about early education, getting a lot of praise from Education Minnesota.
Okay.
Some folks being critical of what he's saying, though, saying you need to start earlier than with 4-year-olds. So there is some criticism out there as well.
What about, did you get any indication of what people were thinking about on transportation at all? Did that come in at all? Because that's a perennial thing that comes up here.
Well, on transportation, interestingly enough, the House Republicans tweeted during the speech that most Minnesotans favor the Republicans' plan for how we're going to fix transportation in the state.
There. Yeah.
So that was one of the key things that I saw from Republicans about the speech.
What was there? And you've watched, Scott, a lot of social media, and you're good at tracking this. What was there?
A state their promises. Insurance is more expensive, doctors are more scarce, and the choices are more limited than ever before. When it comes to health care, the rhetoric just doesn't match the reality. It's time to start over. Republicans would implement a market-based system where competition drives lower prices, more choices, and better outcomes. Some things Minnesotans can be proud of is our first-rate education system. The majority of our students graduate prepared for college or their careers, but unfortunately not everyone is succeeding. Students in low-performing schools are still struggling, stuck in an achievement gap that persists despite an increasing stream of new funding. As the saying goes, do what you always did, and you'll get what you always got. Republicans are not content to stand by idly and watch our students fail. We support early child education scholarships that allow low-income parents to give their children a fighting chance at the school of their choice. Democrats' universal pre-K, in contrast, will put private schools and daycares out of business, leaving fewer options for families. We'll also fight for school funding that's free of government mandates, because the uniqueness of our schools is a strength, not a weakness. In conclusion, the state of the state is good overall. We need a clearer path forward, though. We need leaders who are willing to tackle the tough issues head-on rather than tinkering around the edges. Republicans have the ideas, and the commitment to make bold changes where they're needed. Unlike Democrats, we won't hold back on fixing health care because we're afraid to speak out against Obamacare and MNsure. We won't ignore failing students because Public Unions donates to our campaign. We won't neglect transportation because we don't have the will to prioritize it in the budget. And we won't ask families to pay more than they need to fund the necessities. The same old problems await new, innovative solutions. Republicans are ready to make government work for you. Why should Minnesotans settle for good when great is within our reach? Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Paul Gazelka from Nisswa, delivering the Republican response to the State of the State Address here on Minnesota News Network and this joint broadcast with the uptake. Mike McEntee, let's, we just have a few seconds left here in the broadcast. We are now a little bit under 10 weeks from the end of the legislative session, so we've got a tight timeline, and here we go to the races.
I think we, just like Groundhog Day, it is 10, we've looked at the shadow, and we have 10 weeks of gridlock ahead.
And that concludes our broadcast from McNamara Alumni Center on the East Bank campus of the University of Minnesota in Minneapolis. Governor Mark Dayton's 6th State of the State Address, and of course the Republican response there, just delivered by Senator Paul Gazelka. I'm Bill Werner, and for Mike McEntee with the uptake, have a good evening.